In episode 1 of Outer Banks, you're introduced to the Pogues, and like any area, there's a rich area and a poor area, and most of them come from the poor area, or I should say the hard-working area. There's JJ, and he's come from a long lineage of people who have made their living from the water. He's also an incredible surfer and probably a future kleptomaniac. Then there's Key. She's an environmentalist and kind of a rich kid. She's the only one in the group who actually comes from money, and her family owns a restaurant that's huge with tourists. Then there's Pope. He's the smartest kid in the group, and he's got a scholarship at the moment. His father was kind of like Red from Shawshank Redemption. If you haven't seen that, please, God, stop this recap and go watch that. But he could get you pretty much anything you needed on the island. And then finally, there's the narrator, John B., a teenager who looks 30 years old with a glistening six-pack, who lives by himself because his dad went missing at sea about 8 months ago, and he's presumed dead. His mom split when he was 3, and his uncle's supposed to be looking out for him, but he's building homes in Georgia, so it's just John B. in this shack by the marsh. And right before John's dad left, he told him that he's going to have to go away for a bit. He might actually have to disappear, so his Uncle T is going to come up and take care of him. And that's one of the reasons why John doesn't believe his dad is dead and refuses to sign a death certificate. Until he sees a body, he's not signing. But his current problem at the moment is DHS, who doesn't believe that his uncle is in the picture at all and thinks he's on his own, which he is. They've scheduled a meeting for the next day, and if they don't talk to his uncle, they're going to put him in a foster home. But luckily for John B., a hurricane hits the island, and it postpones that meeting. And this is a double plus because hurricanes are a great time to go surfing, and John goes out, but while he's out surfing, he sees a boat struggling in the water. John paddles in, goes home, hunkers down for the hurricane, and the next morning he comes out to see the damage. And the entire island has been wrecked, but this is also a really good time to go fishing, so he rounds up the Pogues, and they all head out in the water. But as they're driving their rinky-dink boat, it comes to a stop because they think they hit a sand barge. But then Pope notices, holy shit, there's a boat down there. And upon further inspection, John realizes that's the boat I saw last night, and this boat is a really expensive boat that's probably pretty new as well. When they go down to examine if there's anybody dead down there, all they find is a motel key at the moment. So they want to find out whose boat it is, and they go to the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard is busy dealing with everybody else. They just simply don't really have time for them. So they say, all right, well, let's go to the motel then. And the motel is a shithole, and this thing was a shithole before the hurricane hit it. And as Key and Pope stay in the boat, John and JJ head up to the room. Initially, when they enter the room, there's really nothing out of the ordinary except a duffel bag. But then they find a safe and they find the combination, and when they open it up, it's full of money, guns, and a manila envelope. They start posing with the gun and laughing about their luck of finding all this money, but unbeknownst to them, 2 cops are also coming up to that room. And at the very last second, Key gets word to them that they need to get out of there, so they jump out the window and stand on the ledge. And they can see the cops inside, and the cops go to the safe, take the envelope, they also take some money for themselves, and they get out of there. When John B. and JJ get back to the boat, they ask him, hey, what did you guys find? And JJ pulls out the gun and a stack of cash. When they get back to the mainland, there's a body that's been found of a guy named Scooter, and Scooter's wife has been looking for him all day, and even went to his employer, a rich guy named Ward Cameron, where he works on his boat. And while Scooter did help with the hurricane preparations, they haven't seen him since, until right now, when he showed up dead. And the group finds out that the boat that they found was Scooter's boat. So when they get back to John's house, they're trying to figure out what to do with the gun and the money, and Keith thinks they should give the money to Scooter's widow. But John says, no, there's no way. I mean, this guy was a marina rat. How could he possibly afford that kind of boat? I mean, this is a guy that never had more than $40 in his pocket. There's more to this story. And they come to the conclusion that Scooter was probably smuggling because you're not going to do surveillance during a hurricane. He got swept up in the hurricane, the boat sank, and he died. And there's probably a lot of contraband in that boat that's worth grabbing. But Pope tries talking some sense into him, saying, well, if there's contraband in the boat and it belongs to somebody, and if that person comes looking for it, then there's going to be bad consequences. But at the moment, they've decided to just lay low and try to get in that cargo hold of the ship as soon as possible. And one of the ways they lay low is, like every other teenager, they host a kegger. And as they're planning the kegger, the cop that was in that motel room who took the envelope heads to a museum. Because in that envelope, there were pictures in it. And he wants to cross-reference the pictures with a model of a ship because he thinks he's onto something. And the ship just happens to be a ship that sunk in 1829 called the Royal Merchant. And when it sunk, it had $400 million worth of gold on it. And it's kind of been an urban legend around the area. But the cop is looking at the mast of the model and he's looking at the picture he sees, and it's the same thing. So somebody has found this thing. But that night, the kids hold the kegger and they're breaking down the different social classes. There's the Pogues, they're the poor, hard-working group. There are the Kooks, they're the rich kids. And then you have the Torons, which are the tourist kids. And everybody's having a good time until Key notices Sarah Cameron. And Key was best friends with Sarah Cameron in 8th grade, but ever since then they've become enemies. And she's basically like the queen of the Kooks. And John knows Sarah because he works on the same boat that Scooter works on, a boat called My Druthers. And he doesn't have a problem with her, but it seems like he has a problem with her boyfriend because that night a fight breaks out between the two. And it ends with her boyfriend Topper trying to drown John John, quote, just like your dad did. But JJ, being a good friend, pulls out the gun and puts it to the back of Topper's head, and that breaks up the fight. He then fires a couple shots in the air and says, Kook's got to get off our beach. Which there probably was a better way to go about that, but it worked. The next morning, John is woken up by the sheriff, who's asking about the fight and what he was up to, and her main question is, did you find a boat? And John is sticking to the story that he has no idea what she's talking about, and he wasn't in the marsh. Of course, this is all a lie. And she's saying that she can help him out with DHS as long as he's being honest with her. And she demands that he does not go in the marsh because it's a good thing he didn't find a boat. And this works. It scares John into not wanting to go back to that boat because he doesn't think it's worth it. He doesn't want to get put in a foster home. But JJ kind of talks him back into it because Key is rich and she has money, and Pope has a scholarship. But both JJ and John, they're basically the same person. They're broke. And the way JJ sees it, you have nothing to lose, and whatever in that ship can be your way out because they don't send rich kids to foster homes. So John is back on board, literally, because he's got the key to Sarah's dad's boat and they have a bunch of scuba gear in there. So he goes on it and borrows it for the time being. He is caught by Sarah, but she just thinks that he's refueling the tanks, which is something he actually probably should have done. Now he meets his friends at the boat, and they're not supposed to be out in the marsh. In fact, nobody is because the cops are looking for that boat. But then all of a sudden, these two guys show up, and they claim that they're the owners of the boat, and they're going to, quote, help the police. But you know they're bad guys because they're both wearing black shirts, and they're both also wearing jeans, and it's hot outside. But the Pogues sneak out to the wreckage, and they realize, oh shit, none of us know how to scuba. Luckily, though, Pope's read a book, and they all kind of figure it out, and John volunteers to go down. And while he's down there looking for really anything he can find in the cargo, the cops show up wanting to know what these kids are doing out in the marsh when they're not supposed to be there. And as John is coming back up, he notices the cops are there, so he just has to wait in the water. The problem is he's quickly running out of air. Luckily, the cops do leave and John gets back up just in the nick of time. John did find something, and just as they're about to leave, they notice that a boat is coming their way, and nobody's supposed to be out in the marsh, so who the hell are these guys? Of course, they're the bad guys. And they're chasing them down, and they're actually shooting at them. And then Key gets the bright idea to throw a fishing net into the water and jam up their motor, and it works. They get away. And when they get back to John's, they're looking at what they found, and it's this canister that's holding a compass. And nobody's really excited about this find, except for John, who says, holy shit, this was my dad's. In episode 2, John B is convinced that his dad's compass coming back to him is a sign. Early in the morning, he goes to return those scuba tanks to Cameron's boat, but he wakes up Sarah, who is sleeping on it. And he plays it off like her dad told him to do this, but she sees right through the lie and says, okay, well then I'll tell my dad. Because it's bad enough that he stole him, but he didn't even top him off. He begs her not to tell her father, and she says, look, I'm just busting your balls. I'm not going to tell him, don't worry. But unbeknownst to the both of them, her little sister was also in the boat and heard the whole conversation go down. After that, he goes home where there's a Child Protective Services notice on his door, and he goes to sleep. He's awoken by JJ, who's pretending to be Child Protective Services, and scares the shit out of him. And after the initial fright, they both want to know exactly what that compass was doing on Scooter's boat. So they head over to his house to talk to the widow, but they're not the only ones there because those two bad guys are also there. And they're specifically mentioning where is the compass. They wait for the two guys to leave and head on in, and the whole house has been destroyed. They start talking to Scooter's wife about what happened and who are those guys, but she's not giving up any information. John pulls out the compass and asks, does it have anything to do with this? Why was this on Scooter's boat? And she tells him that it wasn't Scooter's fault, but they need to get out of there and not tell a soul that they have that thing, because it's very, very dangerous. The whole time, JJ is trying to convince John to leave, and finally he does because she's not giving up any more information. When John B and JJ get back to Key and Pope asks, what do these guys look like? And JJ's only description he can think of is that they were burly. Pope kind of rags him about this. He says, look, man, I was under duress. And JJ thinks they're drug dealers, but Pope brushes that theory aside. And JJ says, look, all I know is that they were scaring the shit out of her. And these guys are bad dudes. And the thing they were looking for is a $5 compass that we could have easily pawned off. But that's when John B remembers his father's office that he hasn't gone into since his father left. He opens it up and he goes to the history of the compass, because that compass has been passed down through the lineage of his family. But everybody who's had it has died, and not of natural causes. And his father had mentioned that there was a secret compartment that you could keep messages in, and sure enough, John B finds it. And scratched into the compass is the word Redfield. So it seems like John B has his first clue. It's also worth mentioning that his dad was kind of obsessed with the Royal Merchant. I mean, this entire office is littered with theories and maps and diagrams, and his dad was basically an historian for the thing. But John B doesn't have much time to think about that clue because the two guys have shown up at his place. And they start tearing the place apart, but eventually they make it to the office. Luckily, though, the group has snuck out the window and into the chicken coop. And in that chicken coop, they watch these guys just pile all the information out of his office and into their truck. Now, on the rich side of the island, Topper is vowing to get vengeance against JJ for pulling a gun on him. But when he talks to Sarah's little sister, Wheezy tells him she's cheated on every single boyfriend she's ever had, and you're next. Wheezy lets him know that Sarah was flirting with John B. earlier this morning when he was bringing back the tanks that he quote-unquote borrowed. This enrages Topper, and he says those Pogues are dangerous because they pulled a gun on me. But Sarah doesn't see like that because he threw the first punch. The two have a fight that ends when Sarah gets up and leaves. And his feeling is, I'm trying to protect you, while her feeling is, what do you want me to do? John B. works on my dad's boat. And as Topper is leaving their place, he runs into her dad, Ward, and Ward says, hey, how's everything going with you and your family in the storm? By the way, I heard somebody pulled a gun on you. Is that true? And Topper says, yeah, these Pogues, they're just dangerous people. In fact, you actually have one of them working for you, John B. Ward asks, he's not the guy who pulled the gun on you, right? And he says, no. It's just he has a tendency of borrowing equipment. If I were you, I would just make sure everything's nailed down. Now, with the bad guys gone, the group makes it out of the chicken coop, and John B. thinks he knows what that clue means, so they head to the Redfin lighthouse. The lighthouse is closed, so as John and Key head up to it, Pope and JJ stay down low to look out for cops. They knock on the door, and the park ranger lets them know that it's closed, but they say, we're not here for a tour, we're here for the Royal Merchant. And this guy is a Royal Merchant fanatic. And as this guy is showing them where it could have crashed and his theories, and even where he thinks it currently is located, John B. finally pulls out the compass and says, look, does this mean anything to you? Because this was my dad's, and everything that you're saying, he said. So if you have something you can give me or something you know, please tell me because I haven't seen him in months. But all of a sudden, the chatty Cathy park ranger just shuts up and is very, very quiet. John B. gets more and more agitated and is pressing him for information, but the park ranger just grabs his radio and says, hey, can you call the cops? I have 2 kids on drugs up here. John tries to wrestle the radio away from his hand, but ends up shoving his hand in a glass and cutting it up. As John and Key make it down, they see the cops, and they also see JJ and Pope driving away, so they're on their own. They do make it out of there, and as they're walking back, John is convinced that he's on to something, but Key doesn't see it like that. She thinks he's just fabricating stories and trying to see what he wants to see. And she gets it because he misses his dad, but she tells him, I think you're losing it, and she goes in for a hug. Although he doesn't want a hug, he kisses her at the behest of JJ earlier in the episode, who was telling him, dude, she's into you, but she wasn't. And he read the moment wrong. And as he's apologizing and she's claiming he's fine, the cops do end up catching up with him and arresting John. But before they do, John gets the compass to Key. He's brought in front of the sheriff, and the sheriff tells him, I want to help you with CPS, but now you're actually committing legit crimes. You're trespassing, you're assaulting people. And then she levels with him and says, look, I know you found the wreckage. I know you have the compass. So give it to me or I'm going to have to charge you with something. But John is sticking to his story. I don't have the compass. I don't even know what you're talking about. And she can help him with Child Protective Services, and she wants it because it's an open investigation, but John isn't giving it to her. Luckily for John B., he's bailed out by Key's dad, but Key's dad doesn't exactly like him. He's pissed. And as soon as he gets out, Key gives him back the compass. He heads to the marina where he runs into Ward Cameron, and Ward says, look, man, it's been a tough year for you. I know that, and I feel like I've tried to help you. I told you, if you ever needed anything, you could come to me. So I gotta ask you one question. Did you take equipment from my boat yesterday? And John comes clean and says, yes, I did, and starts making excuses, but Ward says, it doesn't even matter. That's not the point. John, I'm sorry. I gotta let you go. And John hunts down Sarah and says, hey, thanks a lot for keeping my secret from your dad. He just fired me. I know a job isn't important to you people, but some people rely on a job to actually eat. Of course, Sarah has no idea what he's talking about because she did keep a secret. As John is walking back to his house, he runs into those 2 guys in the SUV, and they want him to get in there at gunpoint, but John just runs away. They chase after him, and as John is trying to avoid him, he tries to hop a fence, but the fence has a down wire on it, and when John tries to hop it, he gets electrocuted. As the guy is inching closer and closer towards him, that sheriff shows up and saves his ass. She once again reminds him that it's a lot safer if he just gives the compass to her than anybody else, and he forks it over. So John heads home, and at this point, he's going to stop being in denial and just start picking up the pieces and move on with his life. And as he's taking all the stuff out that those guys trashed from his place in his dad's office, he's burning it, but he notices that there's a clue. He goes to round up the troops and drives them to a cemetery because he realized that Redfield isn't a place, it's a name, and it's the maiden name of his great-great-grandmother. As they're trying to get the tomb open, a copperhead snake slithers out, and now they're kind of freaked out. But they also can't budge that tomb door anymore. The only person that can fit through it is Key, and she agrees to go in. And she finds something and says, oh my god. In episode 3, Key finds a FedEx package in the crypt that is addressed to John. And when they get back to John's place, there is a map with coordinates and an X on it, and also a tape recorder with his dad on it. And his dad is apologizing for the way things ended and telling him that it'll all be worth it, and hopefully one day they're listening to this in Costa Rica, but if not, he'll see him on the other side. When the tape ends, John just starts bawling his eyes out as Key consoles him. John is able to get it together, and the group spends the rest of the night talking about how they plan on spending their $400 million. The next day, they need to find out where those coordinates are, and since the hurricane took out the power on their side of the island, they head on over to the Kooks side of the island and sneak into a hotel. They end up using the internet, and thanks to Google Maps, they end up locating where the coordinates are and find out that it's about 900 feet deep to the bottom. And luckily, JJ knows just what they need to get down there, because the junkyard that his dad used to work for has a drone submarine that they can use. The one issue is that JJ's dad no longer works there, and they're going to have to, quote-unquote, borrow it. So they devise a plan where Kia's going to distract the security guard at the salvage yard while the group sneaks in. Kia's going to pretend that her tire is flat, and as he's fixing it, the group sneaks in, but the problem is that the door is locked to the place that's holding the sub. As they're trying to figure out how exactly they're to get around the lock, a dog shows up and starts barking wildly. The security guard hears the dog, but Kia distracts him even more. She goes to let air out of the other tire to buy her group a little bit more time, but the security guard catches her and figures out what's going on. The group scatters, and the security guard goes to meet up with the dog where he's barking up to a boat. Security guard warns that who's ever up there, you better come down or I'm going to shoot, but JJ comes clean and says, "It's just me, man. My dad told me to get in here and get the blowtorch. I didn't want to do it, but if I don't get it, he's going to beat me again." And JJ puts on a really convincing act as he's kicked out. But this bought John B enough time to get into that building and borrow the drone. Now, the Kooks spent their day doing a beach cleanup where they passed the time by passing around vodka mixed with Crystal Light. Everybody's taking some, including Sarah's little sister Wheezy, and this is the first time she's ever drinking. At the cleanup, Topper and Sarah are acting how it was ridiculous the way John acted towards her, but Topper never comes clean that it was him who let her dad know that he was borrowing equipment. When Sarah and Wheezy get home, Wheezy is throwing up because she took way too much of that vodka, and she begs Sarah, please don't tell her dad, and Sarah says, "I won't, as long as you cover for me when I sneak out with Topper tonight." And as Sarah's leaving, she overhears an argument between her dad and her older brother Rafe. Her dad is reaming out Rafe because he was supposed to have generators ready for this exact moment, but he doesn't. And her dad is disappointed in Rafe and just thinks he's kind of being a loser who's just living off of the family money. Rafe finds this whole conversation annoying and reassures their dad that he will get the generators. As he goes to figure out how to do so, he passes by Sarah, says, "I told you never should have bought that bike with the generator money." He heads on over to the rougher side of the island and goes to a drug dealer where he gets some cocaine. Although he doesn't have the money to buy it, but tells the drug dealer, "I'll have the money back to you within 2 days. You know I can get rid of this stuff. I'll even give you my bike as collateral." The dealer says, "That's fine, but just know that you better have it back within 2 days, because if you screw me over, you're not just screwing me over, you're screwing over other people." And that night, he takes the cocaine to the party that Sarah was sneaking out to go to with Topper. At that party, Sarah and Topper start fooling around, and she lets him know that she's ready to have sex. And as they're about to do so, he tells her that he loves her, and she pulls back and decides, maybe I'm not ready. And while she doesn't exactly say it was because he told her that he loves her, I just don't know if it was a coincidence. Topper's kind of pissed off as he heads downstairs and sees the group doing cocaine, and Rafe asks him if he wants to do a bump, and since he's not getting laid, he decides, what the hell, and he does his first bump of cocaine. That same night, a fishing vessel comes in and caught 2 dead bodies in their fishing nets. And they call the sheriff up and ask the sheriff if they know these 2 guys, and it was the 2 bad guys that were chasing the group through the marsh and who tore up John B's house. The next day, as the Pogues are testing out the drone, Pope makes mention that with this much slack, the wrong weather could take this thing all over the place. And that's unfortunate because the weather that day is not supposed to be good, so they're going to have to delay their dive. As the group goes their separate way, John B is at his house looking at the map, and Sarah shows up to set the record straight that she did not tell her dad about John B taking the equipment. And while she doesn't know who told her dad, it wasn't her. Pope and JJ, meanwhile, go to deliver groceries for Pope's dad on the rich side of the island. And one of the stops forces Pope to walk through a golf course that currently has Rafe and Topper playing on it. And Rafe spots Pope and says, "Hey, what's that Pogue doing on our side of the island?" Which is pretty obvious, he's delivering groceries. And initially Topper says, "Look, man, don't worry about it." But Rafe says, "Dude, they put a gun to your head." So both of them jump Pope pretty badly, taking a 9-iron to his back, and steal a 6-pack of beer and ruin all the groceries. When JJ meets up with Pope back at the boat, JJ is thrilled because he just made $100 in tips, but Pope is silent. And it doesn't take too long for JJ to realize he just got mugged. Pope lets him know exactly what happened, and JJ says, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" So the two head over to Topper's brand new, very expensive boat, and Pope swims on over to it and takes the plug out, basically sinking the thing. When Pope gets back to his own boat, he tells JJ, "We can never tell a soul we did this," because Pope is worried that if word gets out that he did it, he'll lose his scholarship. The two then head over to go meet up with Key and John, who are surfing, and Key tells John, "Hey, remember the time you kissed me?" He says, yeah, I do. She goes, "Did you tell JJ about that?" He goes, "Well, I had to because, it's funny. You rejected me." She says, "I didn't reject you. It was just the worst timing in the world." The next day, though, the group heads on out to try to find the merchant. And as the drone is sinking to the bottom, the weather is getting worse and worse and worse. Luckily, though, it doesn't take long after the drone does hit the bottom for them to find the merchant. Upon further review, though, in episode 4, somebody got to the gold first, and the group is very frustrated. Nobody more so than John B, and when he heads back home, he's greeted by CPS, DHS, who's ever there to take him. And his case agent has brought a cop to escort him out of his property. He gathers some stuff and is put in a cop car, and he's looking at a picture of his dad, but he lets that picture float out the window. Immediately, he starts pleading with them to stop the car and go get the picture because it's his last remaining picture of his father. And while the cop says no chance, the case agent says, no, let's do it. And then John begs her to go let him help because the cop has no idea where the picture is. Once again, she agrees, and as soon as she unlocks the car door, John B makes her run for it. He steals a kid's bike and is trying to get away, but then he hits a chain and flies off the bike. He's kind of banged up, but luckily for him, Sarah Cameron is there to see him, and he says, hey, can you take me to a hospital? He really just wants to get away from the cops, and as soon as she drives away, he has her go to that street, he picks up the picture of his dad, and then says, don't take me to the hospital, just take me to your house. She sneaks him past her dad and into his office where she starts patching him up. As Sarah's patching him up, he sees a picture on a wall of a black guy and asks, hey, who's the dude on the wall? And she says, that's Denmark Tanny, he owned the place. John says, how did a former slave come to own this entire place? And she lets him know that he paid for the entire place in gold and ended up buying up slaves all over the place. And then he realizes that he recognizes that name because it was on the crew manifest for the merchant. And while slaves weren't mentioned in the crew, John's dad got the actual manifest and saw his name. So while nobody was supposed to have survived this crash, Denmark Tanny apparently did. And it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together and figure out who has the gold. John asks Sarah, what else do you know about this guy? And she lets him know that we found a bunch of his stuff when we moved in, but my dad donated it to the archives at Chapel Hill. John asks if he can see it, and she says sure, but John wants to go right then and there. And she can't figure out why all of a sudden he wants to go to the archives at Chapel Hill because of this guy. John won't tell her why he wants to go, and she says, well, then I'm not going, and you need me to get in. So John doesn't really have a choice. When they get to the marina, the ferry is sold out and they have to sneak onto a tugboat to get off of the island to Chapel Hill. So as those two are busy on their way to Chapel Hill, Topper and his mom are busy getting the boat out of the water. And the guy who's getting the boat out lets him know that it's going to be about $30,000 to fix and insurance won't cover it because it's operator error. And immediately Topper swears it wasn't him, but his mom doesn't buy it. And as he's working now with his friends, everybody knows that it must have been the Pogues and Pope in particular. So they park outside of Pope's dad's place, and as soon as Pope comes out, they mean mug the shit out of him, and it scares Pope and he runs straight to JJ. And JJ tells him, look man, if they come at you, you look them square in the eye and you deny until you die. Speaking of death, the autopsy came back for those two guys that were found in the ocean, and it's being listed as a homicide. And this is the first homicide that the Outer Banks have had in quite some time. The cop lets the sheriff know that he found some stuff about the merchant on these guys, and he also found some stuff on the merchant in Scooter's motel room. And she makes mention that these were the guys that were chasing John B., which leads the cop to wonder, maybe he finally upped his crime log to the big leagues. The sheriff then heads to the coroner to get an explanation on why he's listing it as a homicide. And it's not like he wanted to, and initially he did think that it was just man overboard, but he gives all of the reasons why, and sure enough, it looks like these guys were set up to look like it was an accident, but were actually murdered. At this point, though, Sarah and John have gotten off the ferry and they're looking pretty raggedy, and they're not going to be allowed in the archives looking the way that they are. So Sarah drags John to this fancy clothing store to get more adult-looking clothes, but John doesn't want any part of it, and he can't afford it. Sarah says, don't worry about it, I'll sugar mama you. And the two are just dressed in white privilege. They decide they probably should have some aliases, so John's going to go by Vlad from Vienna, and she's going to be Valerie from Montreal. And right before they leave the clothing store, John says, why did you come? And she says, well, because I'm 16 and I know what the rest of my life is going to be like, and I needed some adventure. As they're walking over to the archives, she makes mention that her dad went there and her grandfather went there, and everyone would be disappointed if she didn't get in. She then asks John B. about his college aspirations, but he says, yeah, I haven't really thought about it. She then gets a phone call from her dad, who she told she was sleeping over a friend's house. And the two start role-playing about a conversation between her and John's playing her dad. And when John, who's playing her dad, says, wow, he sounds like a real smooth operator, she says, no, he's not. He's clumsy, he uses finger guns way too much, and he has no idea when to make a move. And yet John still doesn't make a move. Take a clue, man. Right before they actually enter the archives, she wants some answers and says, all right, before we enter, I need to know why we're here. And John tells her, I'm on a treasure hunt, to which she doesn't believe initially, but by the look on his face realizes, oh my god, he's actually serious. They head on into the archives and start looking at the stuff, and there's a newspaper article defining that he was lynched because he was freeing too many slaves. There's a book that has all the birthdays of his family members. There's even a picture of the gold to which he paid for the house with, and it is in fact English gold. And then there's this letter that was written the day he died in this Creole language that neither of them speak, so John takes a picture of it to get translated later. Because they find it really interesting that on the day that this guy died, he decided to write a letter to his oldest child. They end up spending the night in Chapel Hill, although we have no idea where they stayed. That same night, Pope, Key, and JJ head to a movie in a park, but it's in the rich area, and Pope and JJ are kind of nervous that they're going to run into the kooks. And sure enough, they do. And when they try to sneak away to go to the bathroom, the kooks end up finding them, and they're outnumbered and a fight breaks out. And Pope and JJ are getting their ass kicked because it's like 5-on-2. Key tries to break it up and goes into JJ's backpack and finds the gun, but thinks otherwise of it and grabs the lighter instead, and lights the movie screen on fire. This immediately causes panic in the park and the fight breaks up. The next day, the cop goes to Topper and his mom and shows her surveillance video of a guy jumping off the boat who seemingly sabotaged it and sunk it. And they can clearly see the boat that he was swimming to was registered to Pope's dad's. The mom asks what's the next course of action, and the cop explains how Pope is 16 years old, so if they want to press charges, it could go to trial and he could be arrested and charged for it. And the cop is kind of alluding to that's a little bit of a harsh punishment, don't press charges, but the mother insists. Topper unknowingly has a bigger issue because his girlfriend is heading back to the Outer Banks with John B, and she is flirting hard. They're both talking about how neither of them really knew each other before this day, and their preconceived notions of each other could not be more wrong. When they get back to the Outer Banks, it seems like they're both going to go their separate ways, but John says, no, I can't do this. I can't pretend that yesterday didn't happen. I can't pretend that yesterday wasn't the best day of my life, and I can't pretend that when I see you, I'm no longer going to think differently. I'm going to say, hey, there's Sarah Cameron. And as he's kind of pleading his case, she runs back, says, shut up, and they start making out. She breaks away and says, we live on a small island, so we got to be careful. And Wheezy, her little sister's prediction that she would cheat on Topper, comes to fruition. Now, while John B did just snag himself an insanely hot chick, I looked it up, she's 22 in real life, it's not weird that I say that, one of his best friends is about to get arrested because the cop walks into Pope's dad's place armed with a warrant and takes him in, and the entire time Pope is mortified because he's just thinking about his entire life going down the drain for this crime. And as his dad and JJ and Key are begging the cop not to take him in, right before he's actually put in the cop car, JJ screams, I did it. And to the surprise to everybody there, JJ takes the fall for it, because Pope has a lot more to lose than JJ. And initially, Pope doesn't even want to allow him to do this, but JJ continues to say that he did it, and the cuffs are taken off Pope and put on JJ, and JJ is thrown in jail. And the last scene is we get to see a glimpse of the guy who murdered those two people, because he has the weapon which they were murdered with, and he has the compass. In episode 6, the sheriff is reading off JJ's rap sheet, and it's pretty serious this time. He's looking at doing legitimate time. But then she puts the pictures of the two dead guys and asks if he knows anything about it. He looks at him and says, those are the two guys that were chasing us through the marsh, and they broke into John B's house, but other than that, I don't know anything. And she tells him that whoever murdered those two guys, she thinks is going to go after John B next, so it's imperative that he go and talk to her. She then leaves the office and tells the cop to go put eyes on John B's house. JJ's bailed out by his dad, and when his dad finds out that he's going to have to pay $30,000 for that boat, he gets pissed off. So pissed off that when he gets JJ in the car, he beats the shit out of him. He continues to berate him at home until he finally falls asleep in a drunken stupor. When JJ finally comes out of his room, he actually points the gun at his dad who's sleeping, but he can't pull the trigger. He just leaves for John B's house. John B, meanwhile, heads to the high school where, amazingly, in the middle of July, there just happens to be a teacher there who speaks that Creole language that John B needs translated. And the letter is from Tanny to his son, written on the day that Tanny died, and it's basically saying how he knows that they're coming for him and he's proud about the work he did freeing the slaves, and how he's looking forward to seeing his son in the afterlife. After that, there's a list of chores that he wants his son to do on the plantation, and the last one is to harvest the wheat near the water. And there's even an emblem of wheat on the bottom of the letter, and that emblem matches the same emblem that was on the gold that he paid for the house with. So John B thinks that is his clue. He thanks the teacher, who apparently doesn't know what a summer vacation is, and heads home. When he's walking up to his place, JJ grabs him and says, dude, somebody's looking at this house. They sneak around the back and grab his boat and escape. And when they get to solid ground, JJ is trying to convince him to leave, but now it's John's turn to try to convince JJ to stay, because John's still going after this gold, and he tells JJ, I think $400 million can take care of the restitution. So while John B was trying to convince JJ to stay, the sheriff goes to meet with that mystery man who killed those two guys. He's got the compass, and he's highlighted everybody who ever lived there with the last name Redfield. And she lets him know, hey, I appreciate the help in the past, but from now on, I'm going to do my job. So she knew who killed him the entire time. Most of the Outer Banks, rich or poor, is getting ready for this midsummer party at this country club. And even though Sarah was looking forward to this for about a year because her dad's getting some big award, she no longer wants to go because she has to go with Topper. And John B is obviously her flavor of the week. But she's not the only one who doesn't want to go because Key's being forced to go and she just doesn't fit that lifestyle. But both girls are dragged to the party against their will, and at the party, Pope is actually working it with his dad. John B and JJ show up at the event because John B wants JJ to get a note to Sarah. And as soon as Sarah showed up at this event, Topper grabbed her and wanted to talk about where she was the other day and really starts interrogating her. Sarah tries to play it off like it was nothing and she wasn't with anybody, but she's not giving him any details, and it's obvious that there's something wrong in their relationship. JJ dresses up like a waiter and sneaks into the event and gets that note to Sarah, which tells her to meet John B by the bag check because John B needs the original map of Tanny Plantation. As JJ is trying to get out of there, he ends up running into the Kooks and makes a break for it because it's 5-on-1. He runs to the party and into the men's locker room, and it's a dead end and the Kooks grab him. Just as they're about to rough him up, security breaks it up. They grab JJ and kick him out of the event, but he's not the only one to go because Pope and Key leave the event as well. So John, Key, Pope, and JJ head off and make a bonfire, and John B tells them about his discoveries. And while Pope was reluctant to believe it at first, now he's all in. He lets him know that he's going to meet Sarah at midnight at the Hawk's Nest, and everyone's cool with it except for Key, who absolutely hates Sarah. John B lets her know that he's really just using her, but that's far from true. And Key tells him, "You don't know her like I know her. She's going to end up using you and getting her way." Sarah does come through, though. She goes into her dad's office and grabs the map of the property, but she is caught by her dad, and her dad finds it weird that she's suddenly taking an interest in the property. He asks if it's for school, and she says no, but it is for a mystery boy that I can't tell you about. When she leaves his office, he moves the painting of Denmark Tanny and reveals a safe, and in that safe was John B's dad's compass. So Ward Campbell was the one that killed these guys. Sarah heads out to the Hawk's Nest to meet up with John B, and John B drives over there with his group, but he says, "Hey, I'm just gonna go up there if it's cool." And once again, everybody's cool with it except Key, who finds this weird and might possibly be a little insecure. Topper, however, has been drinking all night and he's with his boys and wants to make one last plea to Sarah to try to win her back. He sneaks into the Cameron house and up to her bedroom, and he's telling her how he doesn't want to break up and how he loves her. The only problem is Sarah's not in the bed, it's her younger sister Wheezy. And when Wheezy turns over, he is freaked out. And while Wheezy was sworn to secrecy, Topper ends up getting the truth out of her of where Sarah is. So as Sarah and John B are at the top of this observation deck and Sarah is giving him the map, Sarah lets him know, "I'm going to break up with Topper," and the two are making out. Unaware, of course, that Topper is down below watching this all go down. So when Topper finally gets all the way up to the observation deck, he is pissed and a fight breaks out. Not like a legit fight, just pushing and shoving, but the wood on the observation deck is a little rotted out, and when Topper pushes John B, he ends up crashing through it and falls to the beach. Sarah frantically runs to John B and starts screaming for help, and the Pogues end up hearing it and running over. They find Sarah clutching John B's body, and as they run to go get help, Sarah is crying and kissing John B, and Key is watching this all go down shocked. They take John B to a hospital, and when he wakes up, Sarah's right there. She lets him know that he has a concussion and a broken wrist, and then Ward shows up. Ward tells him that Sarah told him that John B was protecting her, and he apologizes to John B for firing him, saying, "Sometimes I have a short temper." Then he tells John B that he would like to be his legal guardian, and John B says, "Yeah, that's awesome." And Ward looks at him and says, "All right, then welcome to the family." In episode 6, John is taken to his new home, the Cameron household, and Ward asks him, "Hey, Sarah needed a map for you. Please tell me you're not going after gold like your old man." But John lies to him and says, "No, I'm not. I'm just a history buff. I probably got that from him. Don't worry." Later that day, he goes to hang out with his friends who definitely do not approve of his relationship with Sarah, especially Key. But he explains, "Look, Sarah got us the map, and without that, we would have nothing." So they start looking at that map. And the thing with the map is, back when it was originally drawn, Tanny Plantation was basically the entire island. So all he needs to do is find that one spot that he was talking about. The problem is, when they do find that one spot, it's owned by a woman who apparently killed her husband. And this is an urban legend that's been passed around through the Outer Banks, but JJ says, "No, I know for a fact it's true, because her daughter used to babysit me. And when her daughter was 6 years old, she heard her parents fighting, but then all of a sudden it just stopped. She came downstairs and her mother's hands were covered in blood as she was washing them. The next day, the mom told her daughter that her parents were splitting up and she never saw her dad again. But what she did see was her mother continuously going to the parlor and bringing out plastic bags. And then one night when she went to use the bathroom, she looked down and she saw her father's head just staring back at her." Now, most of the group does not believe this, but JJ is 100% certain that this woman chopped up her husband. So they have to tread pretty gingerly on her territory. But at this point, she's really old and the property is very unkempt. So all they need to do is just look for water. The problem is, they're not finding any. The only place they haven't searched is the house basement. So they go down there, but there's no water. There's just a bunch of mosquitoes. But that gets Pope wondering, why are there a bunch of mosquitoes down here when there's no water? Because mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. And the group is standing on a bunch of 2x4s, and Pope picks up a rock and drops it in between the 2x4s, and sure enough, there's water down below. When they take off those 2x4s, what they were actually standing on was the entrance to a well. So as the group was trying to find Parcel 9, the sheriff headed over to Scooter's widow's house to try to get some answers. She typed in the coordinates from Scooter's boat to see where he was going, and he was going to this desolate, remote island that nobody goes to. She wants to know why, but Scooter's widow isn't giving her any information, so she decides to head there on her own with her partner. And they start looking over the island really just to find anything out of the ordinary. And what they find looks like the set of Castaway along with John's dad's glasses. Sarah, meanwhile, gets a visit from Topper, who tries one last plea to try to win her back, saying, "I love you and this was supposed to be our summer," but she just doesn't want to hear it. When she blows him off, Topper blows a gasket and starts calling her a slut in her own house, and this alerts Ward, who jacks him up, choking him, and throws him out of the house. And this is really the first mean streak we've seen of Ward, although it won't be the last. The home visits continue in the Cameron household as Rafe gets a visit from the drug dealer Barry looking for his money. but Rafe doesn't have it. And Barry wants to know, why do you have all this nice stuff, but you don't have my money? Rafe reassures him, man, just give me another couple days, I'll get it to you. But Barry ends up grabbing his arm, burning it on the tailpipe of his bike, and taking that along with him and saying, you got 3 days. So needing to figure out a way to pay back the drug dealer, Rafe sneaks into his dad's office, goes into the safe and grabs some money. But when he closes it, Ward is standing there wanting to know what the hell he's doing. Rafe explains and the two drive on over to the drug dealer's house, and Ward throws him the money and says, there, we're even. But the drug dealer starts poking fun at Rafe and Ward, saying he's 19 years old and you're his little babysitter. But Ward finally hears enough and just starts beating the shit out of him. Rafe gets out of the car and is witnessing his dad just rail on this guy. And Rafe promises he'll pay back his dad, but his dad says, no, you won't, because you're a liar and a thief, and you're not trustworthy, and I can't have you in my house, so don't come back. At this point, though, John, Key, Pope, and JJ have gotten back from the house, and John can't wait to tell Sarah that they actually found the location of the gold. He invites her to come hang out with him that night and discuss their next plan of option, but Sarah says, are you sure they're going to be cool with this? And John says, yeah, don't worry about it. But when they actually go to hang out, none of them are cool with it, especially Key. She is infuriated. Key actually gives him an ultimatum saying it's either her or me because I'm not staying if she's here. But John says, I'm not picking. I pick both of you guys, which backfires because they both end up leaving. And JJ is amazed at how awful John played that while Pope goes to console Key. She's sitting on the dock crying about this, and she explains to Pope that when she started the private school, Sarah was her best friend. In fact, the first day, they saved sea turtles together, and it was the best day of her life. But then shortly after that, Sarah turned on her like she does with everybody. And John is simply going to have to choose, but Pope looks at her and says he's too stupid for that. But I'll tell you right now, if it were up to me, it would be no competition. I know who I'd choose. Pope walks back to the house where John and JJ are waiting for a report, and he says, yeah, she thinks you're an idiot. So they concoct a plan to get both girls together to try to bury the hatchet. They trap Sarah in the hull of a boat while luring Key on there, saying that it's broken and they need her help. But as soon as she gets on the boat, they jump off and drive away, saying, you guys can figure out your differences. We'll be back in the morning. They were nice enough to leave food and weed, but both girls are pissed that they're stuck with one another. They end up lighting up that joint, but after a few hours, Key finally says, all right, why did you do it? I was your best friend and I had to find out that you were having a party on Instagram? What did I do to you? I mean, you let that rumor float around school that I broke up the party by calling the cops, and you never even had the courtesy to ask me if I did it. And Sarah says, well, who else would have done it? You were the only one not there. And she says, exactly, why wasn't I there? And Sarah goes on to explain that when people get really close to her, she feels trapped and she just bails, and that's what happened with Key. She apologizes and says that she misses Key and asks if they can ever be friends again, and Key says, I don't know. But Key does eventually apologize for calling the cops. As they try to go to sleep that night, Key says, hey, please don't bail on John B. because he really, really likes you. And Sarah says, no, I won't. Don't worry. The next day, though, when the guys come to pick them up, they both agree not to let the guys know that this plan actually worked. So when the guys ask how it went, they said it didn't, but we've agreed to work together. So that night, the group heads to the house to try to find the gold, but there's motion sensor lights that trip. And Sarah says, we'll just flip the breaker. It's on the porch. I used to play hide and go seek here when I was a kid. And Key decides to go with her. But when they get to the porch, the breaker is no longer on the porch. Now it's in the house. They break into the house, find the breaker, and flip it. And as soon as the breaker is flipped, the guys head on into the basement and start going to work. The girls, for whatever reason, don't get the hell out of there. And as the guys are slowly guiding John B down the well, the rope slips and he ends up falling pretty far. He ends up making a lot of noise, which wakes up the old woman in the house, and she starts coming down the steps, and the girls still don't get the hell out of there. The girls end up making a break for it, but everywhere they turn, it seems like the woman has boarded up the house. So there's not many exits they can choose. John, meanwhile, has reached the bottom of the well and thinks he's found something with his foot, but when he goes down to get it, he finds a human jawbone, and he is freaked out. He frantically starts screaming, get me the hell out of here, and he even starts clawing to get up the well, but when he does, a bunch of bricks fall down, and it actually reveals another tunnel to another room. He decides to take that, and sure enough, he finds the gold. At this point, the girls have made their way out of the house and into the basement, but so is that old woman, and now she's armed with a shotgun. Luckily for the group, though, she's blind, and everybody makes it out of there unscathed and unshot. And as they're driving away, John pulls out a gold bar, and the group starts freaking out because they made it, and they're rich. In episode 7, John is telling Sarah about their plan to melt down some of those gold bars, take it to a pawn shop, and just get some of the money. And as he's telling her this, Ward is in the house, but he's listening in on the conversation, and he knows that John found the gold. So he interrupts their conversation and says, hey, what are you guys up to? And they say nothing. And he says, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to take John fishing. Sarah tries to interject saying we have plans, but when he asks, yeah, what are the plans? She can't think of any, and it's set in stone. The two are going to go fishing the next day. And of course, the plan is to go get the rest of the gold, but that is now put on hold. But the group takes that gold, melts it down into a blob, and takes it to a pawn shop, and they've elected JJ to go in and bargain with the woman because he's a really good liar. At first, she doesn't believe this is actual gold. But then after doing all the testing, she realizes, holy shit, this thing actually is real. The woman goes to her boss, who just so happens to be Barry, the drug dealer, and asks, I got kids out there with 7 pounds pounds of gold. What do you want me to do with it? So she comes back and offers JJ $50,000, and he says, I'm not taking that. I know the market value is 140, which he reminds him, you're in a pawn shop. You're not getting that. They settle on 70, but she says, I don't have that money with me right now. You're going to have to take a traveler's check. And JJ reminds her that the sign clearly says cash for gold. So she says, okay, well, if you go to our warehouse, I can get the money there. And she gives him the address. The kids are heading to the warehouse, and they're on the desolate road, and it just doesn't look like the area where you'd have a lot of money. And they're pulled over by the cops. And as they're trying to stash the gold and stash whatever JJ has in his book bag, but it's not a cop at the window, it's Barry with a bandana around his face and a shotgun at John's head. He orders everybody out of the van and onto the ground and then starts looking for the gold, but as he's doing so, John sneaks away and hides out in the back of his car. When Barry finds the gold, he goes back to his car, starts it up, but John attacks him from the back seat and a fight breaks out. And because it's 5-on-1, the group gets the better of Barry. JJ, though, recognizes him and says, I know this piece of shit, and grabs his wallet and says, all right, let's go see where he lives. John takes his keys, throws them in the woods, and the group heads off to Barry's house. And the group doesn't really know what they're doing at Barry's house. They really don't want to hang around a drug dealer's place, but JJ's philosophy is, well, he just tried to rob us, so let's try to rob him, an eye for an eye. And the whole time, John is trying to convince him not to do this, but JJ is on a mission and finds a stack of cash and takes it. He takes $25,000 from Barry and tries to hand it out $5,000 each and wants to go, but nobody's going. Nobody's moving because they don't want to take the money. JJ hops out of the car and says, all right, what? And John says, well, we're sick of your shit, man. You're robbing drug dealers. You're pulling guns on people. You're out of control. When Pope tries to speak up, JJ cuts him off and says, dude, I took the fall for you. And Pope says, yeah, I know, and I'm planning on paying you back. And JJ says, this is how you're going to pay me back. This is the restitution. JJ storms off and the group lets him and just heads home. But Barry does eventually make his way home and finds out that he's been robbed, and he heads straight to Rafe to get some answers because he recognized Sarah as Rafe's sister. And he tells Rafe, dude, your sister and her little surfer friends just robbed me, and I'm going to get that money one way or the other. But Rafe doesn't believe him because it's just not in Sarah's nature. But either way, Barry is pretty convinced that it was Sarah, and now Rafe has to figure out how to get that $25,000 back to Barry that he didn't even know was missing. And Sarah is currently with Pope, Keith, and John trying to figure out what to do about this gold. And Pope says, all right, our best bet right now is to go down and get all of it at once and put it in a safe or a safety deposit box until we can find somebody who we can trust. And they want to go get it tomorrow morning, but John can't because he's going to fishing with Ward. They're also wondering if JJ is going to make it home, and he in fact does, and gives the money to his dad to take to the cops for restitution. But his dad, while thrilled that he gives him the money, has no plans on taking it to the cops whatsoever. He's planning on spending it and, quote, tripling that money. And when JJ makes a break to get the money back, a fight ensues, and JJ actually gets the better of it. I mean, he really kicks the shit out of his dad. But he's so enraged that at one point he grabs a wrench and he's about to bash his dad's head in, but he just drops it and walks off and says, I'm not scared of you. After the group meeting, though, about what to do with the gold, Sarah and JJ head off, and JJ's about to take her to this abandoned church, but they get cut off by Rafe on his bike. And Rafe wants to talk to Sarah, asking, what are you doing robbing drug dealers? That guy is a bad dude. You see my arm? That's what he did to me. But Sarah tells him, you worry about your problems, I'll worry about mine. Topper shows up, and Topper and John also have a fight about who has more testosterone and who can bench the most. You know, who can be more bro. No, in all seriousness, it had to do with Sarah, obviously. But Topper and Rafe head off, and Sarah and John head to that abandoned church. And John brings her there because it was one of John's dad's favorite places to go. And they start fooling around, but Sarah pulls back and says, this is normally the part where I ditch people. John asks, hey, are you a virgin? And she says, yes, I am. Is that okay with you? And he says, yeah, no, that's fine. We'll wait. And then she asks about his first time, which wasn't exactly a magical experience. At least for the girl, because it was 25 seconds. And trust me, I can relate. But John reassures her, look, it's fine, we'll wait. And she makes him wait, all of about 7.5 seconds before she jumps his bones and the two bang one out. And while John was taking Sarah's V card, Pope and Key got a wench to get the gold up from the well. They take it over to John B's abandoned place by the marsh, but they find a drunk JJ there who spent all of his money on a generator and a very expensive hot tub, and they are dumbfounded that he wasted this money. As they're giving him shit, JJ stands up, and they can see the bruises and know, in fact, that his dad beat the shit out of him. And he's telling them, I bought this for my friends. I'm sorry, I bought this for my family. I thought you guys would like it. And he starts crying. Key goes to console him, and as he's crying on her shoulder, he says, I just can't do this anymore. I just want to be a good person. I can't take him, meaning his dad. The next morning at 2:55 a.m., the alarm clock goes off, although Ward doesn't really need it, because he's been thinking about what he overheard John B say since yesterday. So much so that when his wife brought him a property, which just so happened to be the Crane estate, he wasn't even really paying attention. She explained that the woman in the house is going to assisted living after a bunch of kids robbed her in the middle of the night, but he just puts it to the side. When he meets John at the boat, John tells him, yeah, everybody's saying the fish are this way, so we should probably head there. But Ward says, no, you know what, there's too many people there. We're going to go in the opposite direction. And as they drive out and they're the only ones on the water, Ward says, hey, get me a drink. And as John is getting one, Ward says, you know what, get yourself one too. And John says, sir, I'm 16.
How old are you?
I'm 15, Mr. Burnett.
Motherfucker, you look 30.
Eventually, they get to the point, and Ward says to him, I know you found the gold, and it's amazing. It really is. But John says, I don't know what you're talking about. And Ward says, we'll play it like that. Here's the reality. You're in way over your head, because if it's at the bottom of the ocean right now, you're trying to figure out a way to get it up. And if it's on land, it's on someone's property, and that's theft. So here's the reality. You need me right now. And I know you didn't do this alone. I know you have friends, and we'll cut them in. But what do you say? Me and you will partner up, and I'll help you get this stuff. And John hasn't said a word up until this point and looks at him and says, yeah, I still don't know what you're talking about. And Ward looks at him and laughs and says, okay, once again, if you want to play like that, that's fine. But I know about the missing sub-drone in the salvage yard. I know that you've been all over the island. I know about Redfield. I know that Sarah stole you a map. And he cuts him off and says, whoa, how do you know about Redfield? The only way you would know about Redfield is if you have my dad's compass. Oh my God, you know what happened to my dad. What did you do to my dad? And all of a sudden, Ward just shuts up and doesn't say a word, but he shakes his head to indicate, I don't know what you're talking about, but he looks guilty as shit. John says, okay, fine, well, we'll see what the sheriff has to say, and heads up to the driver's seat and starts steering them home. Ward is down below and very conflicted because he doesn't really know what to do. He can't kill the kid and not come back with him, but he also can't let John show up and tell the truth. So Ward picks up the hook, even though he doesn't really want to, and heads up to the driver's seat to confront John. Episode 8 picks up right where episode 7 left off. John and Ward are on the boat. Ward claims this wasn't my fault, it was your father, but a fight breaks out all over the boat that ends with John B narrowly escaping on a jet ski. And this is after Ward tried to fire a harpoon at his head. And with John B getting away, Ward knows it's only a matter of time before he reaches the mainland, and he'll do so before Ward. So Ward starts setting this thing up to look like he was attacked and takes one of those harpoons and stabs his arm with it. John B does end up running out of gas and swimming to shore, but the first place he doesn't go isn't the sheriff's office. He goes to talk to Scooter's widow. And Scooter's widow finally comes clean that the night that John's dad went missing, she came home from work early to find Scooter and Ward sitting there talking about an accident that occurred. And Ward was claiming that he tried to change the deal. And basically what happened was Ward and John B's dad were out on the fishing boat in the middle of the ocean, and John's dad revealed that he found the treasure, but he wanted assurances. And Ward's thing was, well, you don't have assurances. I mean, we're 50-50 partners on this, but John's dad claimed that he never agreed to that and wanted to give Ward only 20%. Ward's take was, well, you spent 20 years on this and didn't find anything until you started using my resources. That's unfair. And a shoving match ensued. John's dad tripped and hit his head, and Ward went to go call for help, but then thought better of it because John's dad's blood was on his hands. He looked over and John's dad was passed out, so he just dumped the body over the ocean thinking that he was dead, but he wasn't. Because the night that Scooter went missing, Ward sent Scooter to that desolate island to just look for the treasure. And while he didn't find treasure, he did find the remnants of John's dad's body because John's dad didn't die that day. He made it to the shore, and the last thing he did was carve the word Redfield into that compass. Scooter's widow apologizes to John, saying she should have told him earlier, but John just angrily walks out. While that conversation was going down, Ward made it to shore, and the first place he wisely went was to the sheriff's office to report the crime. He tells them that they were having a nice day fishing, but then all of a sudden John B snapped and attacked him and escaped on the jet ski. So they put an APB out for John B. But John B headed straight back to his marsh house, and he blows off his friends who were there and heads straight to get the gun. His friends are asking questions like, what are you doing? But he hops on a dirt bike and looks back at his friends and says, Ward Cameron killed my dad and he knows about the gold, and he heads off. He heads straight to the Cameron household and sneaks in and goes to Sarah's bedroom and asks, did you tell your dad about the gold? And she says no. And he says, well, then where did he find out about it? They both then hear Ward calling for Sarah, so they sneak out the window and go outside to talk privately. He tells Sarah how Ward killed his dad and Ward attacked him on the boat, but she says, no, that's not what my dad said. My dad said you attacked him. But Sarah doesn't believe that at all. She doesn't believe her dad would attack John. Sarah runs back in the house and Ward asks her, I know John was here, but she covers for him and says, no, he wasn't. He says, well, then be honest with me. And she says, you be honest with me. What happened on that boat? And Ward is sticking to the story that John B attacked him, but Sarah isn't buying that either. She's not believing that either of these men attacked one another. After she leaves his office, Ward is sitting there thinking, and he notices out of the corner of his eye the Crane Estate listing. And that's when he remembers exactly what his wife said. The woman is going into assisted living because she was robbed in the middle of the night by a bunch of kids. And that's when it clicks. It was John B and his group of friends. The treasure is on the Crane Estate, so he buys it up. And the next morning when John wakes up, he heads over to the house but sees the for sale sign and then sees the Cameron construction signs, and he thinks, oh my God. So he heads straight down to the well, and sure enough, they cleared the gold out. And as you can imagine, he is livid. That same morning, Pope finally has his scholarship interview, and he asks his dad, hey, are you going to stay? And he says, no, I can't. I have to go clear some palm trees for the runway. Cameron's plane can't take off. It's too heavy. He tries to tell his dad how Cameron's a crook, but he says, yeah, aren't they all? But his money's green and I need it. So his dad's not going to wait for him, and he heads into his interview. And he's being asked, like, what are you doing this summer? And he tells him he's been doing an independent study. He's been trying to find the shipwreck of the SS Merchant. They laugh it off and say, oh, well, did you find it? And he says, yeah, actually, we did. He goes on to tell them about Denmark Tanny and basically the entire story except where the gold is. And they do inquire about it, but then he thinks it's too heavy, and he runs out of the place. He runs straight to his friends and lets them know that his dad had mentioned that Cameron's plane was too heavy, and the only reason it would be too heavy is because he's leaving with the gold and he's leaving that night, and they can still stop him. So they're going to head over there and re-rob him. Now, Ward is planning to bring Sarah to this trip, but his other two kids, Wheezy and Rafe, meet up, and Rafe was kicked out of the house, and he's currently living in an abandoned house of a family that doesn't know he's living there because they're out of town. And he called up his 13-year-old sister to borrow money from her because he's a drug addict. And Wheezy makes mention how they must be the black sheep because dad is taking Sarah to the Bahamas. Something about business. And when Rafe hears that it's about business, he gets really upset because he feels like he knows way more about business than Sarah, and he feels like he's being usurped in the family power tree. Now, there's still an APB out for John B., but the sheriff at the moment is not concerned about that because she goes to meet with Scooter's widow in a church. And maybe it's because she's feeling guilty about her conversation with John, but she tells the sheriff exactly what she told John earlier in the day. Now, Ward is on his balcony looking over his property, and his wife comes to him and says, hey, the bags are packed. Let's go. What are you waiting for? And Ward says, relax. I'm just looking at this property. I don't know if I'm ever going to see it again. And she says, don't be melodramatic. And he says, I'm not. The boy knows about his father, and for the last 9 months, every day he's thought he's alive. Now he knows that I took him from him. His wife tells him, what choice did you have? You didn't have one. She then tries to change the subject and asks, have you heard from the people in Nassau? And he says, yeah, the Caribbean Nationals are set to take possession as soon as my wheels hit the ground. And she says, well, then that's great. We're all set. We're good to go. Don't worry about John. So Ward and Sarah head off to the airstrip. And John and his group have also arrived at the airstrip, although they don't have a plan. And they think they have until night to rob the plane, but they actually don't. Because when Ward shows up there, the guy that's loading the plane tells him, you're going to have to leave way earlier than you're planning on it because of the weight. And Sarah notices that they're loading up these big boxes and asks what's in them, but Ward lies to her and says it's a bunch of marble. Sarah knows it's a lie and doesn't want to go, but Ward basically drags her onto that plane. And John is watching this all go down from afar and realizes that the gold is about to leave the Outer Banks. So he hops in his car, drives through the gate, and tries to catch up to the plane, cuts it off, and prevents the plane from taking off. Immediately, Ward and John start getting into it, and Sarah sides with John, but then the cops show up. And when Pope, Key, and JJ hear the cop sirens, they take off because JJ's on probation, Pope has a scholarship, and while it's Pokes for life, it's not Pokes for life when the Popo shows up. But the cops didn't show up for JJ. The sheriff showed up for Ward. She tells him he's under arrest for the murder of John's dad and starts to handcuff him, but he squirms away and she pulls a gun on him. And that's when somebody shoots her. And out from behind the plane pops Rafe, who's got a big smile on his face and looks at his dad and says, Dad, I just saved you. In episode 9, the sheriff wants John to radio for help, but Ward ends up getting that radio. Ward tells Rafe to take his sister home. Of course, she doesn't want to go. She wants to make sure the sheriff gets help. But when it becomes apparent she doesn't have a choice, he tells John to run, and he does. So Rafe takes Sarah home, and Ward ends up radioing for help. But as he's doing so, he's also uncuffing himself so he doesn't look guilty. After he does this, he radios for another pilot to come and fly his plane to the Bahamas. And as the group is waiting for John B. to arrive, they see that plane take off and they know the gold is gone. And when this happens, Pope ends up smashing everything he can see with a baseball bat. JJ feels like this is the best time to introduce him to weed. And Key is urging him not to do it because it's just not him, but he looks at Key and says, I lost my scholarship. I walked out in the interview. It's gone. And starts blazing up. John shows up mid-puff and lets the group know what happened. Now, the cop does show up at the airstrip to assist and immediately asks Ward who did it, and he blames it on John B. They can't wait for an ambulance and have to transport the sheriff to the hospital themselves. And as they wheel her into the emergency room, the cop looks at Ward and says, we're going to get this guy. And the cop is very emotional watching the sheriff go in. When Ward gets home, he's washing the blood off his hands, and his wife asks whose blood that is. And it doesn't take too many questions for Ward to blow up on her. He goes up to talk to Rafe and lets Rafe know that the sheriff is dead, and he put the blame on John B., and Rafe thinks that's a great idea. But he says now the person we need to worry about is Sarah because she's got a big mouth. But Ward assures him that Sarah won't be talking, and when Rafe tries to argue with him, he flips out on him as well. John feels like he needs to go tell the cops what happened, but when he walks in the station, he overhears on the radio that he is the prime suspect, and he runs out. He hops in the car and tells Key to floor it, and they narrowly escape. But they now know that John is the prime suspect. And because of this, the cops have put a $25,000 bounty on his head and also closed the ferry and the road so that he can't leave the island. Although he doesn't know this. And Pope thinks that that's the place to go, the ferry. Will get him off the island and he'll be good to go. But when they go to the ferry, they learn that it's closed, and they learn about the bounty, and Pope brings back the flyer to the car and shows them. As they're trying to get out of there, somebody spots John B, and another person spots John B, and now a crowd is forming. And Pope, who is still high, mind you, ends up crashing into a couple cars and escaping. He decides to drop John off so John can get away and they'll distract the cops. But his shitty driving is too much for Key, and she ends up taking the wheel because he's so messed up. He asks where they're going, and she says the one place where nobody would suspect. And that's the Cameron household. Well, Ward Cameron has locked Sarah into her bedroom. When Wheezy wants to know why she's locked in the bedroom, Ward yells at her and tells her to go to her room, and she can't figure out why she's being punished. Now, she doesn't go to her room initially and sees her brother packing up a bunch of John B stuff and wants to know why, and her brother lets her know that John B is the one who killed the sheriff. So when the group arrives at the Cameron household, they need a plan to get to Sarah. And as Key and Pope are walking up to the house, Pope thinks it's now a good time to tell Key that he loves her. She says, "You're just high." And he says, "I am, and that's probably why I'm telling you. I'm in love with you." And Key says, "Thank you very much. It's very sweet of you, but it's never going to happen." And she tries nicely to let him down, but obviously he's hurt. You girls are ruthless out there. And the plan is to draw Ward out of the house by lighting his grill on fire, and that's Pope's job. Key, meanwhile, will sneak up to Sarah's bedroom and talk to her. And Pope does his job, and it works. And Key goes up to Sarah's bedroom, but the window is locked. And Key shows Sarah the bounty flyer, and Sarah says, "I don't know anything about it." John, meanwhile, is trying to evade the cops any way he can and ends up running into a random person's garage. But when the cops get pretty close, he ends up going into the house. And when he does this, he ends up seeing one of Rafe's friends. And that's when he knows he's in deep shit. Because this guy doesn't want to hear anything that John B is peddling. John tries to run away, but ends up accidentally running into the laundry room and locking himself in there, and he's trapped. And at first, this guy's really pissed off, but then he thinks, oh my God, there's a $25,000 bounty. I'm going to go get the cops. And he has Topper, of all people, make sure that John B doesn't get out. And Topper isn't really concerned with the fact that John is wanted right now for murder. He's more concerned with the fact that John is Mr. Steal Your Girl. And John apologizes for going after Sarah even though he knew that Topper was dating her. And they get into an argument about who loves her more, and John does admit that he does love her, but all Topper really wants to talk about in this conversation is Sarah and how the chickens are coming home to roost for John. And it doesn't take long for the kid to reach the cops. I don't know why he just didn't use his cell phone anyway. And the cops immediately surround his place and a crowd forms. And in that crowd is Rafe, who is urging the cops to go get him. Because he wants John B gone no matter what, preferably dead so he can't ever tell the truth. Now, Rafe's sister is trying to figure out a way out, and she remembers that she snuck the cup that's attached to the wire that you used as a kid, and the other end is connected to Wheezy's bedroom. She convinces Wheezy to come in even though her dad told her not to, and as soon as she gets her in, she explains to her that John did not kill the sheriff, but she doesn't tell Wheezy who did. She says, "I need you to cover for me as long as possible," and she bikes off to try to find John. But John is stuck in that laundry room, but when the cops go and open the door, John is snuck out via the vent. So now the entire neighborhood is out there looking for John, figuring he can't get far away, and John uses a diversion and runs the other way. Now Sarah figures he probably went to that abandoned sex pad, that church, and she is right. But unbeknownst to her, she's being followed by Topper. And she shows up, and there's John, but right behind her is Topper. And Topper tries to warn everybody of John B's location by ringing the church bells, but John gets him to stop, and Sarah explains to him who actually killed the sheriff. It was my brother, Rafe. She goes on to say, "Why would I rat my brother out? It's my own brother and it's my dad. That's what happened." And Topper is starting to believe it. But his church bell message worked, and the cops, along with Rafe, are heading over to the church. Now, Rafe and the other guy, who I'm not even going to look up his name, end up sneaking in the back of the church. And since Rafe just wants John B dead, he ends up lighting the church on fire, unaware that his sister and Topper are up there with him. Now, Topper, being horrible with timing, figures this is the best opportunity to argue about who loves you more and says, "I can prove it." So he actually switches outfits with John and goes out the front door and distracts the cops as John and Sarah run out the back. So Sarah and John head to a house that Sarah's stepmom is selling so they know it's empty so that they can lay low. And the plan is for JJ to get them a boat the next day, and they're then going to take off for Mexico to start a new life together. When Pope, JJ, and Key wake up the next day, they know John hasn't been caught because the cops are still looking for him. Pope goes to get gas for the boat, but he's being very short with Key, and he's overall just pissed off at her for how she acted when he told her that he loved her. As the kids would say, he's all up in his feelings. Now, since the Outer Banks doesn't have the strongest police force, something called the SBI shows up to assist with the search. And their plan is to go door to door until they find John B., including abandoned houses or ones that are being sold. And with John B still out there, the chance that Ward gets caught and the truth comes out is also still on the table. And because of that, Ward is freaking out a little bit. He tells his wife that there are just too many loose threads, and she tries to get him to leave, but he says, "It's going to look guilty as hell if I just pick up and leave, and I'm also not leaving without my daughter." And that's when it hits her. That's it. You're the concerned father. Go down there and act like you're assisting with the search, but in reality, you're just picking up Sarah. I mean, after all, it's your word against his. Who are they going to believe? and Sarah left that morning to go tell the truth because that's the only way John B is going to be able to get his freedom. But when she gets to ground zero, they're not allowing her to speak to anybody, and she's begging to talk to somebody, and finally she gets the attention of the head guy of the SBI, but as soon as she's about to tell him the truth, Ward shows up and takes her. She's screaming about how John didn't shoot the sheriff and that she was there, but Ward is reassuring him that she wasn't on the tarmac that day, and his wife can attest to that, and she's going through a tough time right now because she was in a relationship with him. She continues to freak out, and finally Ward just goes, okay, then fine. Who shot the sheriff? Thinking that she won't actually tell the truth, but she does and says it was Rafe. And as soon as she says that, you can see the look on Ward's face is just, oh my God, I can't believe she just did that. Ward takes the SBI agent to the side and explains how she was just diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she's in a relationship with this guy, and he's got her all brainwashed. Can I just take my daughter home? And the guy says, yeah, you can, but we're going to talk to her first. The problem with that is when he goes to talk to her, Sarah has escaped because she continued to freak out and ended up kneeing the guy in the balls and running back to John. Ward's other kid is tweaking hard. Rafe heads to Barry's to try to get more cocaine, but Barry's all out and Rafe freaks out at him. He asks Barry, have you ever done something that you never thought you would do, something just unspeakable? And Barry jokes around saying, what could you have possibly done? Messed up somebody's tea time country club? I was in the army. I guarantee whatever I did was worse than you. I got an issue right now. These kids stole my 25 grand. Your sister did. So you don't see me here crying about it. I'm going to go get those kids. And Rafe tells him, it was John B who stole your money. He goes, exactly. And what do you think's going to happen when the cops catch him? He's going to start snitching about me. So I better catch him first and get my money back. So both Barry and Rafe head off to try to find John B. And Rafe wants him gone and preferably dead so that the truth never gets out. So teaming up with Barry to try to find John is an ideal situation. Now Rafe's sister makes it back to John B, but basically as soon as she shows up, they're going door to door looking for him and they have to escape. They grab some paddle boards and paddle away. But they get to a point where John says, look, we're going to have to go our separate ways because I'm going to have to go back to my house and grab the gold that's under my bed. She tells him that it's probably going to be swarming with cops, and he goes, well, I don't really have a choice because we can't start a new life without that gold. I need to get it and sell it. So you're going to meet me tomorrow at the boat ramp. She doesn't want to leave him, but she doesn't really have a choice. And shortly after John B leaves her, Sarah is scooped up by family friends who are out in the water that day, concerned for her safety because a tropical storm is coming in. Pope, meanwhile, headed to his dad's store to try to steal some gas, and he gets caught by his dad. And his dad tells him, you're not going anywhere with that gas, but he says, my friend's in trouble, and I'm leaving with this. And Pope tries to stick up to his dad, and his dad goes right back at him, and Pope ends up punching his dad, but his dad doesn't lay a finger on him. And as Pope is walking away, his dad is just berating him, telling him how ungrateful he is, which honestly is pretty true. Now, Key and JJ go to Key's parents' restaurant to get food for John, and Key is mentioning how weird Pope is acting and how she just wishes the old Pope would come back. The next stop is to try to get the boat key from JJ's dad, which won't be easy to do because the last time the two were together, there was a fist fight. But when JJ walks in, his dad is passed out on alcohol, pills, maybe both. And as he's trying to get the key, his dad wakes up. And his dad is so messed up that he asks JJ in the middle of the summer if he's skipping school. He then gets up and tells him how he loves him and how he gets mad at him sometimes, but how it freaks him out that he reminds him so much of his mother. He passes out and JJ grabs the key and they head off to grab the boat. As Key and JJ drive over to get the boat, they're caught by Barry and Rafe, who follow them there. And as JJ is talking up his dad's boat, both Barry and Rafe show up to try to get revenge. Barry is beating up JJ at gunpoint while Rafe accosts Key, asking the whereabouts of John, although she doesn't know. She does say, however, I know what you did. I know you shot the sheriff. And Barry hears this. But when she says it, Ray chokes her. At this point, however, Pope has shown up, and he's also looking for some revenge, and he kicks the shit out of Rafe. It's awesome. Pope takes out all that pent-up frustration on him, including the fact that this kid mugged him a few days ago. It gets to the point where JJ actually has to pull him off of him. The group leaves, and JJ and Barry are just trying to get their wits about him after getting their asses kicked, and Barry looks at him and says, I'm impressed, country club. The sheriff. But you better hope to God you're worth more to me than that $25,000 bounty, because now I own you. And Rafe knows it. The group heads off to meet John at the boat ramp, and Sarah's warning about the cops being at John's place was correct. They're there going through his dad's old stuff, and the cop finds the map and the gold and says, I think this kid actually finished what his old man started. We just walked into something way deeper than we thought. John from a distance watches the cop take his dad's stuff, including his gold nugget, and puts it in his car. So when they go back in the house, John sneaks in the car and grabs the gold, but when he goes to start the car up, it's a push to start and you actually need the key fob. So he uses the radio and draws the cop out and gets him closer and closer until finally he can start the car and he speeds off. He meets up with his friends at the boat ramp, but immediately wants to know where Sarah is, and she's nowhere to be found and no one's heard from her. And while John wants to wait for her, he knows that he can't. He knows he's got to get a move on. So he reluctantly leaves and says, tell Sarah I'm sorry, and I said goodbye. But he drove there in a cop car that had GPS, so the cops are on their way. Although the group doesn't actually know that. And after they say goodbye to John and they watch him leave, Pope turns to Key and apologizes for the way he's been acting, and the two end up kissing. And it would be a really romantic moment if just seconds later, the cops don't swarm in and arrest him and realize that John has gotten away. They try to shut down the waterways and the roads, but they still have no idea where John is. And as John is trying to make it out, he sees Sarah running on a dock trying to get his attention, and he goes to pick her up. She chastises him for trying to leave without her, and the two take off together. But that tropical storm is approaching the island really, really fast, and they have to be careful about it. Their plan is to get past ground zero and then make their way to Mexico, and they turn off all the lights and go dark, and it seems like they're about to get away until all of a sudden the power turns back on that one side of the island and all the lights come on, including the lighthouse. And in front of all the cops and all the SBI, there they are just sitting ducks. They immediately have to change their plans and they have to drive into the storm because they're forced to by the police who are chasing them. And it gets so dangerous that the head of the SBI calls off the dogs, but they are continuing to go headfirst into the storm, and it's not wise to do because their boat can't handle that. The head of the SBI tries one more tactic and he gets Ward on the line to talk to John. Ward tells him, if you love my daughter the way I think you do, you'll turn that boat around and bring her back and we can figure this whole mess out. But John grabs the radio and says, you killed my father, and then you framed me for a murder I didn't commit. You took everything from me. So just know, I'm coming for you, and I'm going to get what's mine. And both the new sheriff and the head of the SBI heard that conversation and are now staring at Ward. They then lose the radio connection and they can't talk to him anymore, but the head of the sheriff's department tells Ward, you're going to want to stick around, we're going to want to talk to you. But as I said, that boat wasn't made for a tropical storm, and right before it capsizes, John looks at her and says, I'd rather die than go to jail. And then she looks at John and says, I'd rather die than to be without you. I'll give you a minute just to puke. 2, 1. Okay, we're back. Now, the cops and the SBI continued the search, but there was only so much they could do because they were hit with a tropical storm. And the new sheriff comes back and lets Key, JJ, and Pope know that they didn't find John. And initially, Pope thinks that's great, they got away, but his face says otherwise. He explains to Pope that while they didn't find him and they're not dead yet, it's probably unlikely that they got away because of the impact of the storm. And when reality sets in for the group, they flip out, screaming at the cops, saying that you drove them into that storm for a crime that you know they didn't commit. Now, the boat did in fact capsize, but John and Sarah did not die. And as they're floating in the water clinging to the capsized boat, they see a freighter off in the distance. Sarah grabs the gold nugget and tries to get their attention by shining it, and it actually works. They see him. They're brought onto the freighter and given blankets and coffee, and the guy asks, what were you guys doing out there? But they don't give him an answer. They just say, hey, can you drop us off at the next port? The captain agrees, and as he's writing down the paperwork, John says, by the way, where were you going? And he says, Nassau. And Sarah looks at John and says, oh my God, the Bahamas, the gold. And there's a change of plans. They're no longer being dropped off at the next port. They're heading straight for the gold. And that is how the first season of Outer Banks ends. Please consider subscribing to this channel. I would truly appreciate it. If you got this far, I assume you liked the video, but if you thought it sucked, there is a thumbs down button. There's also a share button, so please share this on your social media platforms. Let people know if you needed a recap. Other people probably do as well. There's also a comment section down there that I do not look at because that one nasty comment out of 100 will be the one that I see. So if you say something and I don't respond, don't take it personally, but just know I do appreciate you watching this.